The first thing the nurse noticed was the silence. At 2:17 a.m., the ward was never truly quiet. Machines breathed for sleeping bodies. Rubber soles whispered across linoleum. Somewhere, a television murmured to no one. But when she reached room 317, that sound vanished, as if the air itself had been sealed. According to hospital intake records, the patient inside had been admitted 3 days earlier under observation for acute psychological distress. Female, 26 years old. No prior psychiatric history. No known neurological disorders. Her name is still withheld in the surviving documents, replaced by a black bar of ink that bleeds slightly through the page. The nurse later testified that before she touched the door handle, she felt something she could not describe clinically. A pressure. Not on her chest, but behind her eyes. As if someone were standing too close, breathing without sound. She hesitated. Then she entered. The patient was sitting upright in bed, perfectly still. Her hands lay flat on the sheets, palms down. Her eyes were open, unblinking, fixed on the far wall. The heart monitor showed a steady rhythm. Normal.
Come.
The nurse spoke her name. There was no response. She stepped closer and repeated it, louder this time. The patient's lips parted slightly. For a moment, the nurse expected a whisper, or a plea, or incoherent rambling. What came instead was a voice that did not belong to the body producing it.
Low.
Measured. Controlled. It spoke a language the nurse did not recognize. Not gibberish. Not slurred speech. The words were structured, deliberate, pronounced with careful precision. The cadence was ancient, formal, as if recited, not spoken. The nurse froze. She would later say that what frightened her most was not the sound, but the certainty she felt in that moment. The certainty that the voice knew she was there, knew her name, knew every thought passing through her mind. She backed away, pressed the emergency call button, and left the room without turning her back. Within minutes, the ward was active. Doctors, orderlies, another nurse. The patient had returned to silence by the time they arrived. She lay back against the pillow, eyes closed now, breathing evenly, as if asleep. The incident was logged as a dissociative episode. Stress-induced glossolalia, one doctor suggested. A seizure variant, said another. No one wrote down what the nurse confessed later, in a statement she signed and requested be sealed. That when the patient stopped speaking, she smiled. The woman's problems had begun months earlier, long before the hospital, long before the ward and the machines and the locked doors. According to her family, she had been ordinary. Quiet, intelligent, deeply private. She worked as a graduate assistant in archival studies, spending long hours cataloging old documents for a small university library. Her life was structured, predictable. She attended Mass irregularly, more out of habit than devotion. She lived alone in a narrow apartment above a closed tailor shop. The first changes were subtle. She complained of exhaustion that sleep did not cure. She forgot simple things. Missed appointments, left her keys in the refrigerator. Once, she stood in the shower for nearly an hour, unaware the water had gone cold. Her mother noticed bruises on her arms during a visit, faint fingerprints yellowing at the edges. When asked, she shrugged and said she must have bumped into furniture. Her co-workers described moments when she seemed distant, as if listening to something no one else could hear. During meetings, she would stop mid-sentence and tilt her head slightly, eyes unfocused, lips moving soundlessly. Medical tests found nothing. Blood work normal. MRI unremarkable. Sleep study inconclusive. Anxiety was suggested. Then depression. She was prescribed medication, which she took faithfully, though it seemed to do nothing. The dreams began shortly after. She told her sister about them in a late-night phone call, her voice tight with controlled fear. She dreamed of a room with no windows, stone walls slick with moisture, a smell like old iron and extinguished candles. In the dream, she was never alone, though she could see no one. Something waited in the corners. It spoke to her without sound. Not words, but understanding. Knowledge placed directly into her thoughts. Names.
Dates.
events she had never learned, yet somehow recognized. She woke each time with the taste of ash in her mouth. The final dream ended differently. This time, she said, the thing stepped into the light. She could not describe its form, only that it was wrong, that it wore the suggestion of a human shape the way a mask might be worn over something else. And when it spoke, it did not fill her mind. It used her voice. 2 weeks later, the neighbors called the police. They reported screaming, not shouting, not crying, but sustained, animal-like vocalizations that echoed through the building walls. By the time officers arrived, the noise had stopped. They found her apartment in disarray. Furniture overturned, books torn apart, pages scattered in careful, circular patterns across the floor. Religious items lined the walls, all facing inward toward the center of the room. Several had been broken deliberately. Crosses snapped cleanly at the intersection. A rosary wrapped so tightly around a chair leg that the beads had cracked. She was found in the bathroom, sitting in an empty bathtub, fully clothed, rocking slightly. When asked her name, she answered correctly. When asked where she was, she hesitated, then named a place that did not exist. It was after this incident that she was admitted for psychiatric evaluation. Hospital staff noted episodes of sudden temperature change localized around her bed, cold drafts with no source, electrical interference, lights flickering only in her room. One security camera feed corrupted repeatedly between midnight and 3 a.m., always centered on her door. She began speaking in her sleep. At first, it sounded like murmuring, then chanting. A linguistics professor was consulted after a recording was reviewed by hospital administration. He listened without expression, replaying sections several times. His conclusion was written in careful, academic language. The speech patterns were consistent with ecclesiastical Latin, not modern Latin as taught in classrooms, but a variant used in liturgical texts prior to the 17th century. Obsolete pronunciations, archaic syntax, phrases that had not appeared in common use for hundreds of years. The patient had no known background in Latin, no academic exposure, no religious training beyond basic catechism in childhood. When confronted with the recordings, she denied any knowledge of them. She claimed she could not remember sleeping those nights at all. She did, however, begin to ask strange questions. She wanted to know the names of the doctors who treated her, their birthdays, whether they were married, whether they believed in God. One resident reported that she asked him, calmly, if he had ever confessed the lie he told his father on his 18th birthday. The resident had. He requested reassignment the following morning. Church involvement began quietly. The hospital chaplain visited at the request of her mother, who had grown increasingly alarmed by phone calls in which her daughter spoke in a flat, unfamiliar tone. The chaplain was an older man with decades of experience in pastoral care. He later wrote that he did not believe in possession in the dramatic sense. He believed in illness, trauma, the mind's capacity to fracture. His first visit lasted less than 5 minutes. According to his statement, the patient greeted him politely. She accepted his offer of prayer. She closed her eyes. Halfway through the prayer, she began to recite the words with him, not repeating, anticipating. She continued alone after he stopped, her voice lowering with each line, pronunciation flawless. When she reached the end, she opened her eyes and looked directly at him. She addressed him by a childhood nickname no one in the hospital knew. The chaplain left and did not return. A formal request was sent to the diocese 3 days later. What followed would later be documented in restricted church records, referenced only by case number and date. The attending priest was selected for his background in both theology and psychology. He had assisted in several evaluations involving alleged possession, none of which had progressed beyond prayer and counseling. He arrived at the hospital on a gray afternoon, carrying no ritual implements, no holy water, no crucifix beyond the small one on his collar. He asked to speak with her alone. Hospital administrators refused. A compromise was reached. A nurse remained in the room, standing near the door. The priest introduced himself. She smiled. She asked him why he had taken vows. He did not answer. He asked her if she knew why he was there. She nodded. She said that she had been waiting. The nurse later reported that during this exchange, the temperature in the room dropped sharply. Her breath fogged. The heart monitor spiked briefly, then returned to normal. The priest asked her to pray with him. She agreed. This time, when the prayer began, she did not speak. She listened. Her smile widened. And when the priest reached the final line, she opened her mouth and spoke a single sentence in Latin, her voice layered with something else, something deeper, overlapping the words like an echo inside a stone chamber. The priest fell silent. He recognized the sentence. It was not a prayer. It was a response. The nurse did not understand the words, but she understood the reaction. The priest's expression changed in a way she had never seen on a human face. It was not fear, exactly. It was recognition. Like hearing a voice from a childhood memory you had spent your life trying to forget. He asked the nurse to leave the room. Hospital protocol forbade it. He insisted. After several tense seconds, she stepped outside, leaving the door ajar. She would later admit that she remained close enough to hear every word. The priest asked the patient how she knew the response. She tilted her head, as if considering whether the question deserved an answer. She said the words had been spoken to her long before she learned to speak at all. He asked her what she meant. She replied that names existed before mouths were shaped to say them. That language was only a tool, and she had learned many. The priest told her that if she was frightened, he could help. She laughed. It was a quiet sound, breathy, almost gentle. But it came out wrong, stretched slightly too long, as if more than one throat were shaping it. She told him she was not frightened. She told him she was home. At that point, the priest ended the meeting. He did not pray. He did not bless her. He stood, straightened his collar, and walked out without looking back. That evening, he submitted a formal recommendation to the diocese. The language of the document was cautious, restrained. He did not write the word possession. He wrote anomaly. He wrote preternatural indicators. He wrote psychological explanations insufficient. He requested authorization for a formal right of inquiry. It was granted 2 days later. By then, the patient had stopped sleeping entirely. Nurses reported that her eyes remained open through the night, unblinking, fixed on the ceiling. She did not complain of fatigue. She did not ask for rest. When sedatives were administered, her body relaxed, but her eyes did not close. Security footage later revealed that during these periods, she would occasionally move her lips in silence, as if continuing a conversation no one else could hear. One nurse, new to the ward, made the mistake of asking her who she was talking to. The patient turned her head slowly and looked at her. She answered with the nurse's full name. Then she recited the address of the house where the nurse's mother had died. The nurse fainted. When the priest returned, he did not come alone. Church records indicate the presence of 2 additional clergy, both assigned as witnesses. One physician remained on standby, along with hospital security. Consent had been obtained from the family for spiritual intervention, though the document shows several revisions and visible hesitation in the signatures. The room was prepared. Lights dimmed. Electronic equipment moved back where possible. A simple wooden table was placed near the bed. On it, a Bible, a small vial of holy water, and a crucifix worn smooth with age. The patient watched the preparations with interest. She commented on the crucifix. She said the wood was older than the hands that carved it. No one responded. The priest began with questions. He asked her name. She gave it. He asked her age. She paused, then smiled. She gave 2 answers. One correct, one impossibly old. The physician attempted to intervene, suggesting a break. The priest raised a hand without looking at him. He asked her when the other voice first came to her. She closed her eyes for the first time in days. Her breathing slowed. When she spoke again, it was softer, almost human. She said it began with listening. She said there had always been spaces inside her thoughts where sound did not reach. Places where silence lived. She had filled those spaces with work, with routine, with prayer she did not fully believe in. And then one night, something answered the silence. It did not announce itself. It did not threaten. It taught. It showed her things she should not have known. It corrected her Latin pronunciation when she read old manuscripts at work. It guided her hand when she touched fragile pages, told her which ones mattered and which did not. It was patient. The priest asked what it wanted. She frowned, as if confused by the question. She said it did not want. It remembered. The first physical manifestation occurred shortly after midnight. The temperature in the room dropped again, this time rapidly. Breath fogged. The holy water on the table rippled without being touched. One of the candles flickered, then went out entirely, though there was no wind. The patient's body stiffened. Her back arched against the mattress. Her fingers curled, joints cracking audibly. The heart monitor spiked, then faltered, then steadied in a rhythm that did not match normal human patterns. The physician stepped forward. The priest began the rite. He spoke in Latin. At the first words, the patient screamed, not in pain, in fury. The sound was raw, tearing itself from her throat, layered with a deeper resonance that vibrated in the chest of everyone present. The crucifix on the table slid several inches, scraping loudly against the wood. The witnesses later reported that the scream did not echo. It was swallowed by the room, as if the walls themselves were absorbing it. The patient thrashed, restraints groaning. Her eyes rolled back, showing only white, then snapped forward again, pupils dilated to the edges.
She spoke.
Not in Latin, not in English. The words came in a harsh, consonant-heavy language that struck the ear like stone against stone. The linguistics professor would later listen to the recording of this moment and refuse to classify it. He would say only that it was structured, that it followed rules, that it was not random. The priest did not stop. He continued the rite, voice steady, though his hands trembled slightly as he raised the crucifix. The patient laughed again. She told him he was using the wrong words. She told him the older ones worked better. She began to recite something in response, a litany that mirrored the cadence of the rite, but inverted its meaning. The candles shattered simultaneously, glass exploding outward without heat or flame. One of the witnesses began to pray aloud and was shouted down by the patient in his own voice. The physician shouted for the procedure to end. The priest did not listen. He commanded the presence to identify itself. The patient went still. Too still. Her chest stopped moving. The heart monitor flatlined. For 7 seconds, there was silence. Then she inhaled. The breath was deep, slow, deliberate. When she exhaled, the temperature rose sharply, as if heat had been released from inside her body. She opened her eyes. They were not hers. The irises had darkened to an unnatural shade, almost black, reflecting the candlelight that no longer existed. She spoke a name. It was not a name known to any language currently spoken, but the priest understood it. He staggered back, colliding with the table. The crucifix fell to the floor, landing face down. The presence spoke again. It said the priest had pronounced the vowels incorrectly. It said that was why it had been able to enter. And then it began to speak in Latin once more. Not as a prayer, as a history. The history unfolded without pause. The voice speaking through her mouth was calm now, measured. It carried the weight of someone recounting events they had witnessed, not imagined. Dates were woven into the Latin phrases, anchored to seasons, to eclipses, to the reigns of forgotten kings. Places were named that no longer existed on maps, settlements erased by time, by war, by deliberate abandonment. The priest recognized fragments, not because he had studied them, but because he had read their echoes in marginal notes, in condemned texts locked behind iron grates in diocesan archives, references to heresies that predated modern doctrine, to theological disputes resolved not by councils, but by fire. The presence spoke of monasteries built over older ground, of prayers layered atop prayers, each one meant to drown out what had been spoken before. The patient's body did not move as the words poured out. Her mouth shaped sounds within human endurance, never faltering, never gasping for breath. Saliva pooled at the corners of her lips and ran down her chin unnoticed. One of the witnesses vomited quietly into a waste bin. The priest demanded silence, his voice hoarse. He asked the presence why it had attached itself to her. The answer came immediately. Because she listened. Because she worked among dead words and never questioned why they still spoke. Because she opened herself without knowing it, reading aloud passages meant only to be seen, not sounded. The presence said that language was a door, and she had opened many. The physician interrupted again, shouting that the patient was hypoxic, that her oxygen levels were dropping dangerously. He moved toward the bed with a syringe. The patient's head snapped toward him with a speed that defied anatomy. She spoke his name. Then she spoke the exact time of his own death, down to the minute. He dropped the syringe. The priest ordered him out of the room. Security hesitated. The lights flickered violently, plunging the room into darkness for a fraction of a second. When they returned, the physician was at the door, hands shaking, face drained of color. The priest continued. He invoked authority. He spoke of binding, of command, of expulsion. The presence responded with amusement. It said authority only mattered if the words were intact. It said so many had been changed, so many softened, so many translated poorly. It mocked the modern tongue, called it blunt, imprecise, incapable of sealing anything. As the exchange continued, the patient's body began to change in subtle ways. Her posture shifted, shoulders pulling back unnaturally, spine arching as if accommodating something too large inside her. Veins stood out sharply along her neck and temples, pulsing in time with a rhythm that did not match the monitor. Her voice deepened further. A second resonance became audible beneath it, as if another speaker were slightly out of sync, lagging just behind the primary sound. The witnesses would later argue over whether they heard it. The audio recordings captured it clearly. The priest, sweat soaking through his collar, changed tactics. He addressed the patient directly. He spoke her name. For the first time since the rite began, there was hesitation. The presence faltered mid-sentence. Her face twitched. The priest repeated her name, louder now, urgency cutting through the formal cadence of ritual language. He reminded her of her childhood, of her family, of the life she had lived before the nights without sleep. He asked her if she could hear him. Her lips trembled. A sound escaped her throat that might have been a sob. Then the presence surged back, violently. Her body convulsed, restraints biting into flesh. The bed frame rattled. The crucifix on the floor flipped over, landing upright with a sharp crack. The presence accused the priest of deception. It said the girl was already gone. It said she had been hollowed slowly, piece by piece, through years of attention, of whispered corrections, of gentle guidance. It said there was nothing left to save. The priest shouted a prayer. The air in the room thickened, pressure building painfully in the ears of everyone present. One witness collapsed to his knees, clutching his head. Another screamed that he could not breathe. The patient's eyes rolled back again. When they returned to focus, they were clear. Hers. She gasped, chest heaving violently, as if surfacing from deep water. Tears streamed down her face. She cried out for her mother. The priest seized the moment. He pressed the crucifix to her forehead. He commanded the presence to depart. For a heartbeat, it seemed to work. Her body relaxed. The temperature normalized. The pressure eased. The heart monitor returned to a recognizable rhythm. The witnesses dared to hope. Then the patient began to speak again. Her voice was her own. She apologized. She said she was tired. She said it was too late. Her eyes shifted, tracking something moving slowly around the room, unseen by anyone else. Her gaze followed it until it stopped directly behind the priest. She smiled softly. The presence spoke again. It said interruption was rude. It said the rite had already failed. It said the priest had invited it fully by naming it incorrectly. The priest turned, instinctively, though there was nothing to see. The lights exploded. Glass rained down, plunging the room into darkness illuminated only by emergency red strips along the floor. Alarms blared somewhere distant, muffled, distorted. In the chaos, the patient's restraint snapped. Not tore. Snapped cleanly, buckles sheared as if cut by invisible blades. She sat up. Her feet touched the floor. The priest stumbled backward, tripping over the fallen table. He landed hard, the air driven from his lungs. The patient stood. She towered over him, posture impossibly straight. Her shadow stretched long across the floor, bending at angles that did not match the light. She spoke quietly now. She said the language he needed no longer existed in living mouths. She said it survived only in the dead. She said she would finish the history. The emergency lights flickered again. When they steadied, the patient was no longer standing. She was kneeling. Her hands were clasped together tightly, knuckles white. Her head bowed. The priest stared, stunned, unsure if this was submission or something worse. She began to pray. In perfect Latin. The prayer was unfamiliar, though its structure mirrored ancient rites of protection. Each line was pronounced with reverence, with care. The cadence was slow, deliberate, powerful. As she spoke, the temperature dropped once more, but this time evenly, uniformly, as if the room were being sealed. The alarms outside the room went silent. The priest realized, with growing dread, that she was not praying for herself. She was praying for the room, for the building, for everything beyond it. The presence spoke through her again, layered beneath the prayer like a shadow under water. It said containment was preferable. It said escape was unnecessary. It said the world above had forgotten too much already. The priest tried to stand. His legs failed him. The final line of the prayer was spoken. There was a sound like stone grinding against stone, deep beneath the floor. Then silence. When the lights returned to normal, the patient lay on the floor, unconscious. Her restraints were intact again, unbroken. The bed stood exactly where it had been. No glass littered the floor. The crucifix rested on the table. Every clock in the room had stopped at the same minute. The witnesses were alive. The priest was alive. The patient was breathing. Hospital administration would later classify the incident as a mass hallucination compounded by equipment failure. The church did not. The patient was transferred the following morning to a private care facility under ecclesiastical supervision. She did not resist. As she was wheeled out, she turned her head slightly toward the priest. Her eyes were calm. She told him, in English, that the history was not finished. She said there were still older words to remember. And she smiled. The private facility sat far from the city, beyond the reach of commuter trains and cell towers that lost signal mile by mile. According to property records, the land had once belonged to a religious order that no longer existed, dissolved quietly in the late 19th century. The buildings that remained had been repurposed many times: sanatorium, convalescent home, retreat center, each new use layered over the last without fully erasing it. The patient was placed in a single room on the lowest occupied floor. The windows did not open. There were no mirrors. No religious objects were allowed inside without written authorization from the overseeing diocese. The attending staff were carefully selected. Psychiatrists with backgrounds in dissociative disorders. Nurses trained in restraint and crisis response. A chaplain who had agreed, in writing, that he would not attempt any form of rite without direct instruction. For the first week, the patient slept deeply. Monitors showed long, uninterrupted cycles of rest unlike anything recorded during her hospital stay. Her body appeared to be recovering from a prolonged state of extreme stress. Bruising faded. Muscle tension eased. Her vital signs normalized. She did not speak. When she was awake, she stared at the wall opposite her bed, eyes tracking slowly from left to right, as if reading something written just beyond visibility. Staff documented the behavior, but did not intervene. On the 8th day, she asked for a book. Not a novel, not a devotional text. She asked for a dictionary, specifically, a Latin one. The request was denied. That night, the cameras malfunctioned. Review of the footage later showed no static, no distortion. The video simply skipped. One frame showed her lying still in bed, eyes closed. The next showed her sitting upright, eyes open, mouth moving. There was no record of the transition. Audio captured only breathing. No speech. No chanting. But when the footage resumed its normal flow, the timestamp revealed a gap of exactly 11 minutes. No explanation was found. The first spoken words came the following morning. A nurse entered with breakfast and greeted her by name. The patient turned her head slowly and corrected the pronunciation.
Gently.
Politely. She explained that the stress marker in the middle syllable had shifted over time, but the original form was clearer. The nurse laughed nervously and said she had never heard it pronounced that way. The patient smiled. She said most people hadn't. The supervising psychiatrist was informed. He scheduled a formal evaluation. During the session, the patient was cooperative, oriented. Her memory was intact. She acknowledged the events at the hospital without distress, referring to them as periods of absence. She expressed no delusions, no hallucinations, no paranoia. When asked about the language she had spoken, she said she did not remember speaking at all. She said she remembered listening. The psychiatrist asked her to explain. She paused, fingers tightening slightly in her lap. She said it was like standing behind a door and hearing someone else tell a story you already knew. She said it felt familiar. She said it felt familiar. Comforting. The psychiatrist asked if she felt in control. She considered the question carefully. She said control was a misleading word. She said cooperation was closer. The session ended early. Over the next several days, subtle changes emerged. Books left in the common area were found rearranged overnight, stacked in chronological order by publication date. A bulletin board displaying staff notices was altered, handwritten corrections appearing in the margins, dates adjusted, names spelled differently. One notice annotated with a small symbol no one recognized. The symbol was removed. It reappeared the next day, always in the same place, always identical. The chaplain, who had avoided the patient until then, requested permission to observe her from a distance during recreation hours. He sat at the far end of the room, pretending to read. At one point, without looking at him, the patient spoke. She said his prayers were missing lines. He froze. She continued, still not facing him. She said the omissions were intentional. She said they were meant to protect people from words that no longer had anchors. The chaplain left the room and did not return. The diocese received weekly reports. They grew longer, more detailed, more concerned. One document, later leaked, noted that the patient appeared to anticipate questions before they were asked, adjusting her posture or expression seconds in advance. Another described her tendency to hum quietly under her breath, melodies that, when transcribed, matched the rhythmic structure of ancient liturgical chants, though no recognizable tune could be identified. The humming stopped whenever she was observed directly. It resumed the moment she was alone. On the 21st day, a priest arrived unannounced. Authorization was granted with reluctance. The meeting took place in a small interview room monitored by 2 cameras and an audio recorder. The priest entered alone, carrying nothing. The patient stood when she saw him. She inclined her head respectfully. She addressed him in Latin, fluently. The priest responded in kind. For several minutes, they spoke quietly, too softly for the microphones to pick up clearly. When the audio was reviewed later, only fragments could be discerned, references to councils long dissolved, to debates resolved in secrecy, to texts burned not for heresy, but for accuracy. At one point, the priest asked her if it was still with her. She did not answer immediately. She said it was a poor way of framing the question. She said it was not singular. She said it never had been. The priest's hands began to shake more violently. He asked how many. She smiled. She said that number was also a language problem. The cameras recorded a sudden spike in interference. When the image stabilized, the priest was sitting, head bowed, lips moving soundlessly. The patient was watching him with an expression of what could only be described as pity. The meeting ended shortly after. The priest requested private confession. It was denied. He left the facility pale and sweating and was admitted to a hospital later that night for cardiac distress. He survived. He never spoke about the visit. After that, the patient was restricted further. No visitors. No shared spaces. Meals delivered through a slot. The staff noticed the change immediately. The air around her room felt heavier, not colder, denser, as if sound itself had to push harder to move. Equipment near her door failed more frequently. Batteries drained inexplicably. One nurse reported that her digital watch began counting backward while she stood outside the room. Maintenance found nothing wrong. The patient began writing. She requested pen and paper, ostensibly for journaling. The pages she filled were dense with text. Not Latin. Not any language the staff could identify. The symbols were consistent, repeating with slight variations, arranged in lines and paragraphs. Margins were carefully maintained. Punctuation marks appeared regularly, though their meaning was unclear. A linguist was consulted under strict confidentiality. He examined photocopies of the pages for less than an hour before requesting to withdraw. In his written assessment, he stated that the script displayed internal grammatical consistency and historical layering, suggesting a language that had evolved over time rather than been invented. He added a final note. He said that some of the symbols bore resemblance to annotations found in palimpsests predating standardized alphabets. Annotations that were never meant to be read aloud. The writing stopped after that. The patient surrendered the pen willingly. She told the nurse it was no longer necessary. That night, the power failed across the entire facility. Generators activated, but only partially. Some lights remained off. Hallways fell into shadow. The emergency system struggled, cycling irregularly. Security footage captured staff moving through the corridors with flashlights. At exactly 3:11 a.m., every camera facing the patient's room went dark. Not static. Not interference. Black. When power was restored 20 minutes later, the cameras resumed normal function. The patient was still at her bed. So was something else. At first, staff thought it was a shadow cast by poor lighting. Then it moved. The shape was indistinct, like darkness folded into itself, clinging to the corner of the room near the ceiling. It did not detach. It did not descend. It watched. The patient's eyes were open. She was smiling faintly. When the nurse entered the room, the shadow was gone. The patient closed her eyes and went back to sleep. The incident report classified it as a camera artifact. The nurse resigned the following morning. 2 days later, the diocese issued a sealed directive. The patient was to be moved again. This time, not to another facility, to a place not listed on any map. Preparations began immediately. And beneath it all, in the quiet hours before dawn, staff reported hearing the sound of humming through the walls. Slow, measured, patient. As if something were waiting to be spoken correctly at last, the transfer took place before sunrise. No announcement was made to the staff beyond those directly involved. Shift schedules were altered without explanation. Access corridors were sealed under the pretense of maintenance. Phones were confiscated. Written non-disclosure agreements were signed in silence. The vehicle that arrived did not bear medical markings. It was matte gray, unmarked, its windows darkened beyond transparency. The driver did not speak. 2 men accompanied him, both wearing clerical collars beneath plain coats. Neither introduced themselves. The patient was calm. She dressed herself without assistance, smoothing the fabric of the institutional clothing as if preparing for a formal visit. When restraints were offered, she declined. After a brief exchange of glances between the clergy, her refusal was accepted. As she was escorted through the corridors, several staff members reported the same sensation, a pressure in the ears. A low vibration beneath the floor. The humming had stopped. The absence of it was worse. The drive lasted several hours. No route was recorded. GPS devices inside the vehicle failed repeatedly, resetting to factory defaults without prompting. At one point, the patient looked out the window and softly corrected the driver when he took a turn. She said the road used to curve differently. The destination was a compound hidden deep within wooded land, accessible only by a narrow, unpaved path. According to the limited records that exist, the site predated modern diocesan boundaries. It had no official name. The structure itself was old stone, reinforced with newer concrete in places where time had eroded too much. There were no crosses visible anywhere on the grounds. No signage. No indication of religious use. Inside, the air was cool and dry. The walls were thick. Too thick. The patient was brought to a chamber below ground level. The room was circular, its walls etched with faint carvings worn nearly smooth. Symbols overlapped each other, some partially erased, others cut deeply enough to survive centuries of abrasion. A single light fixture hung from the ceiling, casting shadows that curved unnaturally along the walls. At the center of the room was a chair. Not a medical chair. A plain wooden one, bolted directly into the stone floor. The patient examined it with interest. She remarked that the design had been updated. She said the original had arms. She sat without being asked. The clergy positioned themselves at marked points along the perimeter of the chamber. There were 6 of them now. Older men, for the most part, faces lined with strain rather than age. One carried a book bound in dark leather. Another held a metal container sealed with wax. None of them spoke. When the heavy door was closed, the sound echoed longer than it should have, reverberating until it seemed to sink into the stone itself. The lead priest began to read. The language was not Latin. Not entirely. It was something older, reconstructed carefully from fragments preserved in marginal notes and forbidden appendices. Every syllable had been debated, tested, refined. The rhythm was slow, deliberate, exhausting. The patient listened. Her posture was perfect. Her eyes were bright. She corrected him. Quietly. He faltered, stopped, and adjusted his pronunciation. She nodded. The reading continued. Minutes passed. Then hours. The air in the chamber grew heavier, pressing down on lungs and thoughts alike. Sweat beaded on the priests' foreheads. One swayed slightly, but did not move from his position. The patient began to speak. She did not interrupt. She layered her voice beneath the reading, matching its cadence, weaving a second current of sound through the first. Her words were softer, almost affectionate. She spoke of continuity, of preservation, of the mistake humanity had made in believing that forgetting was the same as defeating. She said that language did not die when it was no longer spoken. It waited. The lead priest raised his voice, pushing forward through the next section. The symbols on the walls began to react. Not glowing, not moving, but becoming visible, as if something had been peeled away from the stone, revealing markings hidden beneath the surface. Lines sharpened. Curves deepened. The carvings seemed to lean inward, toward the center of the room. The patient closed her eyes. She smiled. The temperature dropped steadily, evenly, like a controlled descent into cold. The priests reached the final segment. This was the part that had never been tested. The words had been assembled from 3 separate sources, each incomplete on its own. There were gaps filled by educated inference, vowels reconstructed from context, consonants guessed based on parallel usage in adjacent texts. The patient opened her eyes. She shook her head. She said they were close. She said close was not enough. The lead priest hesitated, just for a moment. Then he continued. The reaction was immediate. The sound in the chamber changed. Not louder. Deeper, a resonance built beneath the words, vibrating through bone and stone alike. Dust fell from the ceiling. The chair groaned under strain, with fibers screaming softly. The patient's body tensed. Her hands clenched. Her voice rose. She spoke over the priests now, no longer soft, no longer patient. The layered resonance returned, stronger than before, overlapping her voice like a chorus slightly out of time. She said the words were wrong. She said they had always been wrong. She said the errors were intentional. The priests shouted the final line in unison. The chamber shook. A sound like a deep crack echoed through the stone beneath them, not sharp like breaking rock, but slow, like pressure being released after centuries of restraint. The light fixture burst. Darkness swallowed the room. In the dark, something moved. Not the patient, not the priests. Something vast enough to displace air as it shifted. Several of the men screamed. One fell silent abruptly. The lead priest continued to speak, voice breaking, forcing the final syllables out through sheer will. The patient laughed. Not cruelly, almost fondly. She spoke a single word, perfectly pronounced. The movement stopped. The pressure vanished. Emergency lights flickered on, bathing the chamber in red. One priest lay on the floor, unmoving. The other stood frozen, eyes wide, mouths open, unable to speak. The patient sat quietly in the chair. The restraints, added at some point no one remembered, were intact. The symbols on the walls had faded back into near invisibility. The lead priest lowered the book. His hands were bleeding where the pages had cut into his skin. He asked her, in a broken voice, what she had said. She answered calmly. She said she had named the boundary. She said that was all it ever respected. The door to the chamber opened. Medical personnel rushed in, checking vitals, shouting instructions. The fallen priest was pronounced dead at the scene. Cause undetermined. The patient was uninjured. As she was escorted out, she paused at the threshold. She looked back into the chamber. She said it would hold. For now. She asked how long they planned to keep forgetting. No one answered. The chamber was sealed. Officially, the site does not exist. The patient was listed as transferred into long-term ecclesiastical care. No further public records were made. Years later, a maintenance worker assigned to an unrelated property in the same region reported finding a room beneath a collapsed structure. The walls were carved with symbols worn nearly smooth. At the center was a chair bolted into the floor. On the stone beneath it, someone had scratched a single line of text. Not Latin. Not any language he recognized. But when a photograph of the text was shown, years later, to a retired linguist who had once consulted on a sealed case, he reportedly went pale. He said the inscription was not a warning. It was a correction, and that whoever wrote it had been very careful with the vowels. The correction did not remain isolated. Within months of the maintenance workers' discovery, small irregularities began appearing across unrelated archives. Librarians in different countries logged identical errors in digitized manuscripts, letters shifting subtly between scans taken years apart, diacritical marks appearing where none had existed before. These were not random corruptions. The changes followed consistent phonetic rules, always toward older forms, always toward stricter pronunciation. According to internal correspondence later uncovered, at least 3 academic journals rejected papers that attempted to document the phenomenon. Reviewers cited equipment calibration issues, confirmation bias, and improbable coincidence. One editor privately advised an author to abandon the research entirely, warning that continued pursuit could attract unwanted attention. The author ignored the advice. He disappeared 6 weeks later. The patient remained in ecclesiastical care. Officially, she was described as stable, nonverbal, compliant. Her file noted no further incidents of anomalous behavior. Requests for follow-up evaluations were denied or redirected. The priests involved in her containment were reassigned quietly, some retiring early, others transferred to administrative roles far from pastoral duties. No one attempted another rite. Those who had been present in the chamber understood why. The boundary held, but boundaries require maintenance. The patient aged. Photographs taken at irregular intervals show her appearance changing far more slowly than expected. Lines appeared at the corners of her eyes, but her posture remained unchanged. Her gaze stayed sharp. Her expression remained composed, almost serene. In one image, dated nearly 2 decades after her arrival, she is seen seated in a garden enclosed by high stone walls. Snow rests on the ground around her. She is not wearing a coat. Her hands are folded in her lap. Her lips are moving. Audio recordings were not permitted. A single incident disrupted the silence. A young priest, newly assigned and unaware of the full history, entered her quarters carrying a modern prayer book translated into several contemporary languages. He intended only to read quietly, to offer presence rather than intervention. He sat across from her. He began to read. She waited until he reached the 3rd line. Then she corrected him. Softly. He stopped, startled, and asked her what she meant. She told him the translation was incomplete. She told him entire clauses had been removed over time, stripped away because they were difficult to reconcile with evolving doctrine. She said those clauses were not ornamental. They were structural. The priest asked her how she knew this. She smiled at him with something like kindness. She said she had been listening for a very long time. The priest left the room and reported the exchange. Within the hour, the prayer book was confiscated. The priest was reassigned. The patient was moved deeper underground. There are no windows there. Only stone. Only silence. Except, occasionally, for the humming. According to the final sealed report, compiled decades after the original exorcism attempt, the greatest error had not been mispronunciation. It had been assumption. The assumption that possession was invasion. That something external had forced its way in. The documents suggest a different conclusion. That the patient had not been overtaken. She had been educated. That what spoke through her was not a singular entity, but a continuity. Voices preserved through exact language, carried forward by those capable of hearing them. That the rite had not failed. It had succeeded too well. The boundary named in the chamber still holds. But boundaries are not walls. They are agreements. And agreements depend on memory. The last entry in the file is unsigned. It notes that the patient requested no books, no writing materials, no visitors. Only time. The author of the entry adds one final observation. During routine checks, when the facility is quiet and the lights are low, staff sometimes hear her speaking. Not loudly. Not urgently. As if instructing someone very young. Teaching them how to shape their mouth. How to breathe between syllables. How to pronounce the vowels correctly. Because the words are old. And they're patient. And they're waiting to be remembered.